I'm Reggie Nichols. I am currently president and senior consultant with Diamond Consulting Group. It's a consulting practice that I've had over many years in different places, mainly doing fund development work, leadership development, organizational development, and diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So, and it's trying to put all those things together. As you read from my, if you read in the bio, I've been around the Christian space for a long time. I went to Gordon College in Massachusetts. I'm a New Yorker, so if you hear a New York accent come through, it's real. But if you hear a Boston accent, that wouldn't be good. So, and then I went to Fuller Seminary and then University of San Francisco. I fell into fundraising. How many of you have ever, anybody just fall into fundraising? Yeah, I fell into fundraising. I started a school in 1983 in San Francisco, and we had to do, it was urban school, and we had to do, we were asked to raise $3 million in a year. Capital fund. I didn't know what that was. And I just fell into it. And then I took some other positions in jobs that I loved. And always in jobs that I loved is I've been an executive, a president, vice president of organizations. It's always had to do with fundraising. And I've asked questions about how do we develop diversity, equity, and inclusion in the work that we do. So the social justice theme is run all through my life. I love fundraising, and I love organizational development. So I thought today we can just talk about a couple of things as we go through a presentation today. Some of the goals of the session are to be able to define DEI. How many of you have heard of DEI? Yeah, it's a hot topic these days. So, but as I work with various groups, one of the challenges is defining it, making sure that everybody's on the same page. So before we leave today, we'll have some definitions of DEI and its implications for fund development. Another goal is understand why DEI is important for organizational health, growth, and the success of the organization. And lastly, we're going to identify 7 DEI strategies that you can take home at least one of those strategies and put them to good use. How's that sound? Great. Cool. Let's go for it. So first, I want to get some definitions out the way. First, diversity. What is diversity? A lot of times we hear diversity having everything to do with color, and I always say diversity is more than black and white. It's always more than black and white. We have defined it sometimes, but diversity is the mix of differences that may make a difference in the interactions, either individual to individual, individual to group, or organization to organization. These could include nationality, ethnicity, gender, age, physical abilities, sexual orientations, economic status, education, profession, religion, and organizational affiliation. Diversity is the mix of differences. What is equity? Equity, not just equality. Sometimes we get those two things confused. We think that equity and equality are the same things, but equity refers to the process of creating spaces, an environment that allows for equal opportunity access outcomes related to social indicators for members of historically underrepresented and marginalized communities. Equity also refers to addressing the systemic disparities that exist between individuals. A lot of the DEI work is focused on equity. So when you hear a lot of talk about what is this, how do we move the needle, it's talking about equity, the social and the systemic challenges. And we're going to talk about some of them because some of them are embedded in fund development. And lastly, inclusion. Inclusion occurs when people are working together effectively and their cultural experiences and differences feel valued and engaged. Now, this is important. We just had a panel discussion, and Brad, I'm so glad that you had women on the panel because this is a challenge. I mean, this is a challenge, talking about inclusion. How do you help people feel valued and engaged? And is it different? Is it different for men and for women? Is it different for different cultures? How do you do that? And how do you know what to do? Inclusion is leveraging the difference in a way that increases the contributions and opportunities for all. I was thinking about what Jesus said, come and see. Come and see. What would it look like for your organizations or your donor base and all that? Come and see. Is it different now? Is it expanding in the kingdom of God, or is it just the same and using the same techniques and using the same things for the same people all the time? How is it changing? So I want to talk about a little bit about some things that are changing, some fundraising facts. A lot of talks I give about demographic shifts in education because I know that very well. The demographic shifts in education are happening at an alarming rate. And you've seen them, the birth rate for children because of the economic downturn. There weren't a lot of children born, and that's going to have a ripple effect on everything that we do. And I was recently director of leadership development for the United Methodist Church in California and Nevada region. And I talked to the pastors and all them about, hey, we got to be very careful about the demographic shift that's going to affect everybody. So a couple of key things that I wanted to talk about. First, change is happening quickly. Have you noticed that in your organizations, the work that you do, that change is happening quickly? In fact, there was onecause.com had a blog. They listed some things that have changed over the last 10 years. The evolution of mobile technology. You remember, it's not even 25 years since the iPhone was introduced. And now, if you go to the airport or anything, everything is technology, everything is iPhone, everything is donation by text or that type of thing. Extending engagement beyond the ballroom. A lot of galas were happening prior to the pandemic. It's going to be interesting to see how they continue after the pandemic. The heightened focus, as I listened to the panel, the heightened focus on donor experience changed. Because in the past, it might be okay to send somebody a robo-letter. Somebody got the understanding that that was okay. But now everybody's going, that's not okay. The donor experience has changed. People want to be connected. Diversifying to a multi-channel fundraising strategy. So doing a variety of different things across a variety of different cultures changed quickly. The introduction of peer-to-peer and social fundraising. 15 years ago, peer-to-peer social fundraising was not a thing, but it's changed real fast. The move to paperless. The shifting donor demographics, which we'll talk about a little in depth. The increased demand on data and impact. Everybody wants to see the data and the impact of your work in tangible terms. The do-it-yourself movement. I don't know if you've watched HGTV or Do-It-Yourself Network that's now becoming a big thing in Magnolia Network. How did that happen? The do-it-yourself. People want to do it yourself. People want to be involved. And the rise in social responsibility. Want to make sure that the monies that people are giving are having an impact, and not just an impact on their local communities, but are making a difference. Second thing is diversity is happening from the bottom up. The leadership in most organizations are not diverse. We know that. I've seen that. According to a recent Aspen Leadership Group report, 90% of the CEOs in nonprofits are white and not people of color. And 90% of the nonprofit board chairs are white and not people of color. 22, according to this Aspen study, 22% of them have done a diversity, equity, inclusion audit. 62% of them said that racial diversity is important, especially after George Floyd and all the things that have happened. But according to their study, only 10% have moved diversity, equity, inclusion up as a priority in the work that they do. So it's happening from the grassroots. It's happening from the bottom. There's a groundswell that's changing, and it's going to have an effect on our fundraising. The labor force is diversifying, and your staff should be also. Growth in the labor force will come from minorities. Well, I say, quote, minorities, because I remember when I did my dissertation in 1991, I did my dissertation on an African-American school, and I referred to the people in the African-American school as minorities. And my professor said, Reg, why are you calling them minorities? They're majority in your school. Why are they minorities? And it's the same thing that's happening now. We're calling people minorities, and they really might not be minorities based on numbers. As immigration and birth rates are increasing among certain populations, these what we call minorities are becoming majorities. The donors and employees will continue to diversify. So the donors, employees, how about in your own companies? Have you seen an increase in diverse people? And I really want to make sure that it's not just black and white. Have you seen an increase in gender, racial, ethnic, cultural? How about in the communities that you serve? How about in the work that you do? Something has to be going on. I was talking to someone at a table about Idaho, Boise, Idaho. Yeah, how about that? There's a lot of change, a lot of people moving to Boise, Idaho, changing the whole trajectory of Boise, Idaho, and Nampa, Idaho, and Portland, Oregon, and a lot of these other places. They're changing. And the labor force is diversifying and changing. Look at the ads on TV. I always look at ads. Look at the ads on TV. Have you noticed that the advertisements on TV are more diverse? I should ask you, what have you noticed about them? What have you noticed? Maybe it's just me because I'm looking at it through my own eyes. Have you noticed something with the advertisements on TV? The family constellations, who's represented on TV these days, which would never have happened years ago. A recent survey from the Gina Davis Institute on Gender in Media, for example, found that 38% of characters featured in advertisements at this specific festival were people of color compared to 26% in 2006. 18% of the characters in the ads were black, and the characters of color were as likely as white characters to be featured in prominent roles. It's funny that if I asked you about the State Farm commercial, and State Farm is one of the largest insurers in the country. Who's there? Who's there? Who's representing? 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that wasn't happening. How about American Life or any of those other, this is what you're seeing. You're seeing a shift in the labor force. Advertisers have a strong financial incentive to keep investing in diversity. 62% of consumers say that our brand's diversity or lack thereof impacts their perception of it. 62%, according to a 2019 Adobe survey of over 2,000 adults in the United States and United Kingdom. And 34% said they stopped supporting a brand because they don't see their own identity reflected in advertising. Labor force is diversifying. We're seeing it. We're seeing the shift. There's an increase in cross-racial marriages, and children are integrating cultures. This is a big one. I don't know if you've noticed it, but I just, I don't watch TV a lot, but since the pandemic's there, I see these things. Have you noticed the increase in interracial couples on TV? And the interracial marriages are increasing. 15% of all new marriages and 9% of all marriages are classified as interracial. 15%, compared to less than 0.5% in 1950. So as development professionals, we can no longer assume that everyone in the household comes from the same cultural background. Multiracial adoptions are on the rise. More people are identifying, and I saw this as vice president of university, more people are identifying as mixed race than ever before in the categories, or not putting down race. And by the way, according to 2020 Medical News Today article, you know how many gender identities there are listed? 87. 87 gender identities. Now you might say, well, as a born-again believer as I am, what has that got to do with me? Well, I'm telling you, the landscape for the work that we are doing is changing. The interracial marriages is increasing. Regardless of how we feel about it, regardless of how we think about it, as we enter into and dialogue with donors, we have to be aware that things are changing, and we might have to change also. The demographic shifts are not limited to the coastal areas. Everybody thinks that it's all happening, in New York, on the East Coast, on 95 and I-5. Everybody thinks it's happening there. Let me tell you, is not. The biggest changes are happening in the interior because the housing costs on the coast are too much. So people are moving in droves to places where there might not have been diversity. I said Boise, Idaho. A friend of mine who's African American, and his wife is African American also. She won Mrs. Idaho. I was shocked. I said, how many people? But that just lets you know the trend is happening in those places that were not diverse. So I tell people, if you don't think it's coming into your neck of the woods, just wait a while. It's going to come there. The diversity, the cultural diversity, the ethnic diversity, it's going to be there. And what does that mean for your donors? Affordable housing space, lower cost of living, Wyoming, Idaho, Colorado, Oregon, it's all changing. And finally, there's a cultural generation gap between the young and the old. We heard a little bit of it today when someone said, well, I'm not on Facebook, or I'm not on this. And we see that there's a generation gap coming, not just between young and old, but between the cultures also. There are competing priorities between the younger generation and the baby boomers. The technology, how many of you are allowing cryptocurrency in your donor work? Yeah. I mean, when they name a stadium crypto.com in Los Angeles, you know this thing is big. But again, it shows some of the gap, because when I talk to people my age and older about cryptocurrency, I don't know what that is, and I'm not going to be involved in it. The youth are desiring, well, not just cryptocurrency, but electric vehicles and all what that means. It's a whole gap, a gap between young and old. And the youth are desiring more social involvement and investment and data and tangible impact. And they want it now. And they want it now. And the speed of change is happening very fast. I was just thinking in my lifetime, I can't imagine. My father-in-law is 90, and for him, I have an electric car, and I showed him my electric car. He said, let me see under the hood. I said, Pop, there's nothing under the hood you can do. He said, I don't want to get in a car I can't monkey with something under the hood. I said, you can monkey with it. You just get electrocuted, that's all. So, but change is happening very fast, and how can we adapt to it? So some of the demographic changes that impact fundraising: increasing number of major metropolitan areas have become majority-minority communities. By 2050, non-white and Hispanic Americans projected to comprise a majority of our national population. Women control a majority of the nation's wealth, and women are more likely than men to be charitable donors. This is from Diversity in Fundraising 2020. Population of Americans aged 65 and older is projected to more than double to 88.5 million by 2050. U.S. households headed by seniors typically have a net worth 29 times greater than those headed by persons under 35. Population of people with disabilities is projected to increase in future years. African American and Asian philanthropy represents a larger percentage of discretionary income as compared to the overall population. A total of 7 million Hispanics and African Americans had a net worth of more than $500,000 in 2011. Asian Americans have the highest median income of all ethnic groups in America, and Nigerian Americans are the most highly educated of all American ethnic groups. Did you know that? All these things will impact our fund development, and all these things are challenges or opportunities that we have in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. African American giving creates an annual giving economy of at least $23 billion. But a lot of the major donors, we don't go after African American donors in the main. Why is DEI important? It leads to better business outcomes. A McKinsey company released a study of 366 companies that found that when companies commit themselves to diverse leadership, they are more successful. If organizational culture is a system of shared values and beliefs that can lead to behavioral norms and in turn guides the members of the organization, then our work in the DEI space helps people, looks at how people approach their work, looks at what we heard a lot today, how people interact with one another. How do you build relationships? And how do you solve problems? If you believe that diverse groups solve problems better than single groups, a single person, if you believe that like I believe it, that's why I think Jesus had 12 disciples. So the theology of me is going to come out, because if anybody could have saved the world by themselves, God could have done it. If anybody could have advertised, done the marketing advertisement, writing in the sky, exactly what needs to happen, without building relationships, God could have done it, but he did not. God did not do that. He had 12 folk and more that were very diverse in their understanding, and he listened to them as he journeyed. Aligning espoused values or operational values leads to better business outcomes. Some of the work that I do is asking organizations, what are your espoused values? And most people say, well, we want a diverse workforce and all that. And I go, hey, that's great. I say, okay, what are your operational values? How are you operationalizing that? Well, we're not. Have you done a DEI audit? Have you looked at how your marketing and all that, how is that working for you? If you want an ideal organization, you'll have members that are working to their full potential, and most people want that. You your employees that take initiative. You want them to think independently. You want them to participate without taking over. You want them to voice unique perspectives and concerns while working toward consensus. DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, leads to better outcomes. The one-size-fits-all as a fundraising model is not effective. We heard that again today. It's not one-size-fits-all. According to a 2018 U.S. Trust study of high net worth philanthropy, giving is better shaped by a diverse donor universe of different ages, ethnic backgrounds, gender identities. Also, women are at the forefront of philanthropic engagement and impact. This is what the study found. On the donor side, research suggests that fundraisers have an opportunity to increase engagement with non-white communities. The majority of all racial and ethnic groups recently surveyed by Blackbaud indicated that it was important to support nonprofit organizations. In fact, African American and Hispanic donors said they would give more to charity if they, you said that, I think, yeah, if they were asked more often, but felt that they were solicited less frequently, and this is the case for most groups. Some false assumptions. Diverse donors are new and emerging as philanthropists. The cultural spaces, they've been fundraising, they've been doing the donor thing for a long time. It's not new. We just got to get into what people are doing, but it's not new. They've been giving for a long time. I've heard this a lot on a variety of things. There aren't enough qualified, diverse advancement professionals. I've heard that a lot. I've heard also that advancement professionals going to high donor folk or major donor folk, it doesn't work well because people like to see people that look like them, which in some sense is true, but in another sense, it doesn't help move the needle for the kingdom of God. False assumption 3, the knowledge, just having the knowledge, the cognitive knowledge of diversity, equity, and inclusion is enough. Is not enough. Once you have it, you got to act on it, you got to put it into process. So let's talk, I'll break. I'm going real fast because I'm mindful of our time and I'm mindful of energy. So, any questions so far? I threw a lot of data at you, but I wanted to talk about some tips. Sure.
Under the false assumption number 2, that there are not enough qualified, diverse advancement professionals.
Right.
I would actually, like in my experience, I don't think there is enough qualified, diverse, but I could just be seeing through my false lens, right? And so could you say more about why that's a false assumption?
Sure. I think I started out with, I fell into it. Most of us fall into it. And there are people out there that, given the opportunity, they could enjoy this work. We just don't ask them. And I look for key qualifications. I remember I was head of school at a school in San Antonio, Texas, St. Thomas Episcopal School. I was the first African-American principal in this all-white school. And I remember thinking of getting a development officer. And this one person, she said, well, I've never done development before. But she had the qualities. She was friendly. She could do, she was approachable. I look for those types of things. So I'm not looking for all of these other things, whether they have done the AFP, certified fundraising. I'm not looking for all of that. I'm looking for specific qualities that can help people in the fundraising space. Just like I fell into it. I know, by the way, we had to raise $3 million in a year, and we did it. We did it, thanks to Bill Hout. But we, and I fell into it. But I grew to love fundraising. So when people say do fund development, I say, I love it, if it's a cause I believe in. How wonderful to match donors who have money with a cause that they believe in and work those relationships out. That's the fun part. Yeah, I got all the technical things you got to do, but that's the fun part. When you see people say, yes, that's something I believe in. Thank you for giving me the opportunity and taking care of them and taking them seriously. This is the joy of it. But it's finding those people, those diverse people, and they're out there, that might not have thought about fundraising. Even the definition, if I go into an ethnic church or something, I go, how many of you want to be fundraisers? How many of you want to be development professionals? No. How many of you love people and like talking to people and like engaging people in things that are important? And I'll teach you strategy. I'll teach you some of the techniques. We'll learn those things. But come in with the core. Being engaging and gracious and understanding mission and loving God. These are the things that are important.
Thank you. Because you know what I would say in response after your answer? I would say there aren't enough qualified advancement professionals. And my answer is exactly the same answer as you gave, except you reminded me that diversity, so thank you. Thank you. Wow.
They're out there. Because I fell into it. I love it. And if you'd asked me when I was 20, I would be fun. What? Strategic tip number 1, define diversity, equity, and inclusion for your organization and commit to change the organizational culture. Define it. Make sure that everybody's on the same page with the definitions. The definitions, it's a challenge to assume that everyone knows and agrees with the definition. How do you define diversity, equity, inclusion? How do you define race? How do you define racism? How do you define culture? Get those definitions out on the table. What does woke mean? Cancel culture. Othering. What does that mean? Let's get the definitions out on the table and let's talk about them. Understanding that diversity is more than black and white. So when people bring diversity up, they're mainly talking about black and white, and they're normally talking about representation. And some of you have seen things that are very diverse. You look at a brochure and you see this rainbow of people and you go, oh, that's a diverse organization. Nah, not necessarily. They might have people on the brochure, but it doesn't mean that they're necessarily diverse organization. Because culture is more than what's stereotypically visible. Culture is like an iceberg. You see the visible stuff up top, but the real essence of culture is below the water. What can you commit to this year in your organization, either out-facing or in-facing? Strategic tip number 2, benchmark your DEI activities, your tools, and your resources. Look at some of the activities, your discussions. How are you involved in professional development? I appreciate everybody coming to this session, but are there your other fund development team? How are they involved in professional development relative to this issue? What are your resources that you provide for them? What are the ways your organization listens and reflects and takes time to reflect? Is there an alignment between your espoused values and your operational values. These are things you can benchmark. Strategic tip number 3, be intentional about marketing. Review your marketing demographics. Annually, look at your demographics. Who are your donors? Who are your major donors? Are there others in the area that you need to target, that you need to go after? Think about those types of things. Review your messages and your communication strategy. We heard it today. Consider donor preferences. What does the donor enjoy? Ask them. Their priorities, their habits, their cultures. See, when you're not aware of the DEI and the impact on fund development, you might go to a person of color or a person of a different gender and do the exact same thing that you do for everybody else. Ensure your online activities are accessible. It's funny to hear about, seniors and money and this and that. It's hard, but how do you make it accessible to people? A lot of churches are trying to do tithe by phone and text and all that. So for a lot of seniors, it is a challenge for them. So how do you make it accessible for them? Are you providing resources in various languages? Because language is a purveyor of culture, and if you're not thinking about providing resources in various languages, you might be restricting your cultural outreach. And if you can't, create partnerships with other organizations that reach your target audience. Great partnerships with other organizations. You see a lot of that happening with HBCUs these days. HBCUs seem to be getting a lot of money these days, and it's because they're connected, people are connecting with them to do good work. Strategic tip number 4, be authentic in diverse donor relationships. We heard about storytelling. Storytelling, I love hearing stories and telling stories. The challenge with hearing stories and telling stories is you have to make sure that the story that is told from the person whose story it is, and is not embellished. The impact of a good story is well documented, but be inclusive in your language. As one writer said, be inclusive in your language and not exploitive and non-exploitive in your concept. I've seen this happen where we mean to do good things for people and we inadvertently stereotype them. When I was president of the Piney Woods School in Piney Woods, Mississippi, the way the former president raised money was they raised money because they called the children at-risk children. And I had a problem with that because as soon as they called them at-risk children, before I came, they were hiring folk and say, come and work with these at-risk children. So right there, you have people that are coming into the organization going, oh, these are at-risk children. They're different from those other children. And they'd raise a lot of money from these at-risk children. I said to the faculty, what if all these children had $1 million and they came to school with $1 million? Would you treat them differently? Would you think about them differently? Would they be at risk then? Well, kind of not. even in our donor profiles, sometimes inadvertently, will make a certain group of people seem like they always need money. And they can't give money, but they need money. So it's just being mindful of the messaging so that you're not othering folk in the desire to do good work. Don't be the author of someone else's story. Let them tell it in their own words and review it before it goes out in publication. Be careful not to perpetuate the othering or negative stereotypes. Do not dehumanize or victimize the subjects. Does that make sense? Strategic tip number 5, connect DEI strategies with fundraising impact. The Aspen leadership groups worked with the hospital philanthropy, and they identified 3 aspirations for fundraising impact. The hospital philanthropists want to serve as direct connections to all the members of communities. So they saw their role as not only raising money, but building relationships. And we heard that in the panel today. It's not just about giving a check, but it's how do you build relationships? And how do you build relationships in the community? Because the mission is so important. Engage donors interested in community impact and invite a broader and more diverse community members into the work and the mission. So how do you not just work with folks strategically to get money, but how do you broaden the impact by getting community members, people who want this thing to work and want their community to be better? How do you bring a diverse group of people into that conversation? And how do you recruit and develop teams and boards to reflect communities and their diversity? So on the boards that you work with, on your development teams, are they diverse? Is your community diverse? Is it moving? How are you making it work? It's going to be diverse after a while. Your community is going to be diverse, by the way. So what are the strategies that you are doing to show and connect your DEI strategies with your fundraising impact? This is what we're doing. With the money that we're raising, this is what we're doing to change the trajectory of this community and make it more like the kingdom of God, which is diverse. Establish a pipeline for diverse talent and get feedback. So to get at Brad's point, I think it's a good point. What's your pipeline? I remember we did a search at the university, and we employed a search firm, and we told them that we wanted a more diverse pool. And I asked the question, where do you go to recruit faculty of this search firm? And they listed a couple of places. I said, have you gone to any of the HBCUs? And I listed them. I didn't say HBCUs because everybody knows that. So I listed a couple of them. They go, oh, I didn't know. Oh, I never heard of that. I never heard. And these are big HBCUs like Howard. And, like, oh, you don't, oh, wow. What's your pipeline for diverse talent? And how do you get feedback? Diverse teams have more understanding, experience, and perspective upon which to draw, allowing them to be more creative about reaching more donors and engaging them more deeply. Listen to this, a Chronicle of Philanthropy, December 2020 article said, onboarding is the key to retention. 90% of employees decide whether they're going to stay within the first 6 months. Onboarding is the key. not orientation. Orientation points to the task. Onboarding facilitates relationship and support. So when I talk to organizations, I go, what's your onboarding? Because it's not the recruitment of diverse talent. It's the retention of diverse talent. This is where we fall apart, and it's because of the onboarding. And once you dig into the onboarding, you can see the discrepancy between the espoused values and the operational values. And last but not least, strategic tip number 7, continue to broaden your professional and your personal networks. Now, you might say personal. That's too personal for me. But I say do both. So part of the analysis or the evaluation that I did for the university for faculty is ask them not only how in their professional work, how they were doing in DEI. But how are you doing DEI personally? Oh, aren't you interested in the kingdom of God being diverse? Espouse values. How are you operationalizing that? What are you doing? Who are you around? So, that's a lot for an hour. Any questions, comments, ideas, thoughts? And I'll leave a final thought in a minute. And I have some resources that are in the handout also. Some thoughts, ideas? Yes, one and then behind. Uh-huh.
Yeah, so I would imagine a lot of us probably face this issue in our fundraising.
Mm-hmm.
We have organizations that are taking some steps toward DEI initiatives.
Right.
Our donor bases tend to be older, white, very conservative evangelicals.
Right.
Who might look at that and say, you're shifting your theological values and becoming progressive.
Right.
How do you manage that tension or convince them that it's actually a biblical principle?
Right, right, yes, right. Well, it is a biblical principle, right? So, but that's why I said the kingdom of God. I think it's getting back to theology. What does the kingdom of God look like for us? And what is our role in making that happen? As people, as fund developers, as organizations, we can continue to go down this road and continue to do what we've always done and identify it as liberal. Anything moving away from that is liberal, but that's not true. It's about the kingdom of God. And what does God, and I always go back to what Jesus did. I mean, this is what Jesus did. So I think it's just talking those things through. And the challenge is, and I understand it as fundraising professional, you're going to lose people. This is the challenge. You're going to lose people. People are going to say, I don't want to, that organization is becoming too, and you go, well, I'm doing God's.
God has plenty of money.
Well, I think that, but the impact of not only the outreach to a variety of donors, but the change on the inside for those on the team that are doing the work, it's the right thing to do. And that's why a lot of times there's a lot of hesitation about moving into this space. I got it. I understand it. But to me, you can't compromise on. Well, you can. People do it every day. But you shouldn't compromise on those things because it's vitally important. And all of the metrics says that the organization is better for it. You want to talk about outcomes? Let's talk about business outcomes. I'll show you that. Let's talk about how people work together. Diverse groups work together better. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the kingdom of God and God's work in the world. I mean, these are big issues, and I've been a lot of times the only person of color in an all-white organization and moved the needle and dug under the rocks, for good, for better or for worse. But at least people know that this is important. This is important, and I try not to be offend people, but I know, but my very presence and my very work is going to be offensive. I hope that answers some of your questions, because it's a question, it's there. But people are going to, some donors are going to, you're going to get more though. You'll get more donors, because I believe that there are more people that believe that that's the right way to go. And the younger generation coming up believes it. Yes, question behind, yeah. Uh-huh.
So I work in Portland, Oregon, and it's known to be one of the whitest cities in America. And I work in an organization that, for sure, CEO is white, most of our team is people of color. And what I'm curious to know too is we have a lot of organizations, smaller nonprofits, who do similar work that we do,
Right.
that are run by people that are from communities of color. And so oftentimes thinking about philanthropy, thinking about going and getting more diverse donors,
Right.
I walk the tension as well too of if I'm going after a small selection potentially in that city that is from communities of color, I'm taking away from other nonprofits that are doing the work that are from those communities.
Right.
So do you have any thoughts or ideas of how one can be more collaborative? Because what we do have working in our favor is the reality that we work with government agencies, so
Right.
we're sitting at the table in those
Right,
things,
right.
but it just seems really wonky
Right.
to suddenly start pursuing individual donors, especially when personally I kind of have a conviction where I'd rather have the money go home, and
Right.
a nonprofit that is run by people.
Right. That's a challenge. I lived in Portland, Oregon, so I got you. So, yeah, it's a challenge. I think you got to weigh the challenge. I think the people, I believe God's net is wide. And people that are giving, people of color that are giving to charities run by people of color are good things. But I think there's also an opportunity to engage them that want to be engaged in the work, the important work that you're doing. And I say important work because you got to say, well, is this work important? Or is the work, which I know is a challenge, but you got to ask the question, is this work that the grassroots, the downstream, I was going to call it downstream, but I don't want to get it negative. So the downstream work is important, and the upstream work is important. And you don't want to say, hey, stop working downstream, come upstream. You got to have both. You got to have some of both. That's what, God's net is wide, so throw out the net. And there are going to be people that leave this one organization, grassroots, and going to support you for whatever reason. I think it's important.
Deal with that tension. Then I now think of like our executive board or our white leadership. Communities like that are very small and we're
Yes.
So how do you then manage still keeping those positive outlook and relationships within those communities when they're knowing that if you suddenly take in or you're suddenly
taking their donors. Yeah, much. Yeah. I'm gonna ask that question to others. I'm gonna see other people. What are some thoughts about that? Because it's a valid thought on both sides, right? Right? Because you could be a white development professional and you're going, hey, there are black donors that are given, or people, donors of color that are given to these grassroots organizations. I don't want to take them, right? To come over here, but so let them just keep giving. Some thoughts? Yeah?
One more so on a programmatic level, but we have done it a little bit in the donor realm as well,
Right.
and that is to build collaborative relationships early with those other organizations.
Yes.
And hopefully your CEO and top leadership would embrace the idea of, can we raise the water for all of us?
Yes.
And approach it that way. Even as a development officer, yes, I'm representing my organization, but I'm representing kingdom impact communities. And so I'd love to talk to you about what God's doing in your heart and how that might connect with us or with this organization or with that organization. You need to have your leadership support
Right.
in that mindset. And go in and say, we can do initiatives, we can do relationship building in a way that's about helping multiple organizations, not just ours.
Right.
And we've done that with some of our ambassadors where they've had incredible cultivation relationships built up, and at the end of the day, that donor ends up giving more to another organization we pointed them to
Yes.
than they gave to us.
Yes.
And I think you can do that in an intentional way, especially recognizing some of those communities of need,
Yes.
but also those resources of need.
Yes. Yes.
But that has to be an intention of your team, and you probably need to open the door relationally with
Yes.
those other organizations.
Yes. Yeah.
There's one in our community specifically where I've gotten to know the CEO,
Yeah.
and I've pointed people to them time and again because they're doing incredible work, slightly different than ours, that aligns with people's hearts for the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And we've seen that benefit us and them.
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel competitive.
Yeah. I like that thought. I like that thought because bringing a luncheon together, bringing people together could be a great thing. A lot of churches deal with that, with stealing members. So, but how about taking it up the next level to the broader community impact? How can we impact the broader community as opposed to stealing donors? How do we bring this up to a broader community, promote the broader impact? It could be similar to the Giving Day. It could be lifting it up to that level and asking the questions about what we can do broadly, bringing the professionals together and talking about what we can do broadly to help all organizations. And God's net is huge. So I appreciate that. That could be one suggestion. Some other questions, thoughts, comments? Tired activities? Yeah, I'm good. Thank you so much for your time today. I'll be hanging around here through tomorrow, then flying back to California. So if my eyes look red, it's because I took a red eye this morning, right? So I'm good. Thanks so much. Thank you.